Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm Nella Scott. I'm the PR and Communications Manager here at Cundall, and I'm here to welcome you to our final webinar of 2020. So today, Richard Twin, Sarah Linnell, and Qian Li will be discussing whole life cycle carbon assessments, answering the what and the how. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. The presentation will run for 45 minutes with a 15-minute break at the end. We encourage you to post your questions via the Q&A box throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer them all at the end. Lastly, this session is being recorded and you will be able to watch it back via our Cundall Global YouTube channel. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Richard Twin, who will start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Nella. Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for joining. My name is Richard Twin. I am Principal Consultant at Cundall, and I'm going to be running through a bit of introduction about Kundal and a bit of background on whole life carbon. First, in terms of the agenda today, so I'm going to be talking through some of the drivers for change in terms of climate, and also what exactly it is we mean by whole life carbon. I'm then going to pass over to my colleague Sarah, who's going to be looking at whole life carbon assessments, the basics of those, and then on to my colleague Qian, who will be talking through whole life carbon assessments for the GLA and the tool that we've developed with the Construction Industry Council for Hong Kong. There will be an opportunity for Q&A towards the end of the session, so please do make sure you're putting your questions into the question box. Firstly, a bit of background about Cundall. So we are multidisciplinary engineering consultants working across a range of areas, civil engineering, building services, acoustics, and of course, sustainability, and many more. We operate globally, but have offices in Europe, Asia, and Australia. Now, at the heart of what we do, we try and put both people and planet. We have a very strong sustainability strategy, and we believe in practicing what we preach. So we were the first consultancy to be recognised as a One Planet living company, and just earlier this year we became the first consultancy to achieve carbon neutrality, and the aim is that we will be carbon positive by 2025. Now, of course, we are talking about carbon today, and I'm going to start just by setting a bit of a scene in terms of climate change background. Now, just recapping exactly where we are at the moment. So already we have seen since pre-industrial levels around 1 degree of global temperature increases. And we're already starting to see the impacts of climate change in terms of heat waves, droughts, flooding, and of course wildfires are the latest phenomenon to be covering our screens over the summer. Now, the Paris Agreement was signed 5 years ago now, with the aim of trying to limit global temperature increases to ideally 1.5 degrees, but 2 degrees as an upper limit. Now, it seems almost certain that we are going to break through the 1.5 degree barrier in the next decade or so, and all of those impacts that I just outlined will become more acute through that. But as we step up through temperature increases, that is only going to get significantly worse. Indeed, the difference between just 1.5 and 2 degrees is losing double the amount of natural habitat, and hundreds of millions more people exposed to the risk of climate-induced poverty and ill health. Now, that is the upper bound, but the context for today is that current policy commitments actually put us on a trajectory to 3 degrees of warming, which is climate catastrophe. We are talking about the same sort of impacts, but so much worse. So there is a real push on at the moment to try and improve the ambition of global policies to make sure that we don't hit that outcome. So in terms of commitments, basically this is why net zero carbon is the new big thing, because in order to limit global temperature rises, we need to be getting down to net zero emissions, ideally by the middle of this century. This is a list of national governments who are looking to set net zero targets or have already done so themselves. So the UK became the first major economy to set a net zero carbon target 2 years ago, closely followed by France. And so far, there are 7 of the G20 that either have targets in law or they are looking at developing them. They have them in a policy document. And you'll see down at the bottom there, China is a very conspicuous one, which has just been added to the list. We can expect over the next year, in the run up to COP26, the UN summit to be held in Glasgow towards the end of next year, we can expect the rest of the G20 to be running quickly on the coattails of China to try and catch up in setting their net zero targets. And of course, it's not just national level. You may be aware that around 70% of UK local authorities have already declared a climate emergency, many of them setting net zero goals in advance of our national goal for 2050. So quite a lot of them aiming for 2030 or earlier. London, which actually set a 2050 target before the national target, is largely expected to push their target back to probably 2030 following the mayoral elections later this year. Now, what does that actually mean for the built environment and for whole life carbon? How does it link? Well, this is the global breakdown of emissions. And of course, built environment is responsible for about 40% of this here, both the building operation, so that's all the energy that's used in buildings, all new and existing buildings, of course, and an additional 10% from building materials and construction. And whole life carbon is about taking all of those impacts together and trying to achieve the best outcome, balancing each of those. Now, why is that important from a net zero point of view? Well, the World Green Building Council has set out a roadmap for a Paris compliant built environment globally, which says by 2030 that new buildings should operate at net zero carbon and should have 40% less embodied carbon. And by 2050, the more difficult outcome that all existing buildings need to achieve net zero carbon in operation, and all new buildings need to achieve net zero whole life carbon. And that's really what we are talking about today. So just diving into a bit more detail about what is covered by whole life carbon. So these are all of the impacts which are associated with a building throughout its life cycle, and all add up to create whole life carbon. These are the modules taken from the international standard for building LCAs. That's the catchily named EN 15978. And here you've got, first of all, the embodied carbon, and that includes what's called the upfront carbon, everything before practical completion, before a building is even operated. So that's everything to do with the production and transport of materials and products that go into it, and the on-site emissions from construction. Then for use stage, there is embodied carbon associated with that in terms of repair, replacement, refurbishment, alongside the operational impacts, so operational energy and operational water, which is often focused on solely in terms of zero carbon. And of course, there are end-of-life impacts as well, which is module C over to the right here. That includes things like demolition, waste disposal. And then beyond the building life cycle, there are also benefits that are taken account of. So reusing materials at the end of a building's life can potentially provide carbon savings as well. Now, how does that break down in terms of your average building? Well, obviously, it varies quite significantly by building, but the UK Green Building Council has got some indicative figures for offices, residential blocks and warehouses. You'll see the blue colours are the embodied carbon, the darker is for upfront carbon, that is everything before practical completion, and the lighter blue is the embodied carbon from the rest of the life cycle. And then you've got two operational energy, the darker orange, which is regulated emissions, so everything that's covered by building regulations, lighting and services, and then unregulated emissions, which is plug loads. And you will see that there is quite a variation in the breakdown, but embodied carbon can account for at least 2/3 of the whole life carbon of a new building. So it's important to be taking all of these things together in order to understand the best outcome for whole life carbon. Now, in terms of how we're doing in terms of progressing towards this, well, policy has been very slow to pick up on whole life carbon. We are starting to see a few city authorities and the European Commission looking at assessments for whole life carbon as the first step, with the eventual aim to hopefully introducing targets. In the UK, GLA is the furthest ahead. In the London Plan, there are requirements for whole life carbon assessments. Greater Manchester has included similar wording in its draft spatial framework, and so we'll probably be following closely on the heels. And in Europe, the EU levels framework is a new framework which is trying to standardize the metrics for the sustainability of buildings, and whole life carbon is a central part of that. We're expecting to see that over the next few years it will become an increasing requirement for public procurement and potentially for regulation. Of course, whether we follow suit with any of that is anyone's guess this week. And from a national perspective in the UK, unfortunately, we are still waiting on any sign of looking at whole life carbon. This is a photograph of Extinction Rebellion protesting outside the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government about the Future Home Standard, that it doesn't include embodied carbon. And as yet, we don't yet have any indication that it will be. So there's still an awful lot of progress that needs to be made at the national government level, but there seems to be more leadership happening from city authorities in the UK in particular. So that's enough from me in terms of context. I will hand over now to Sarah, who will take you through the basics of whole life carbon assessment.
Thank you, Richard. So yeah, before I go on, we're just going to hand over control of the slides. And I will be just discussing very briefly the background of whole life carbon assessments and the relevant guidance that's been released over the last few years. And then Qian will go on to explain a bit further about this and in more detail relating to the GLA and the Hong Kong Construction Industry Council tool. Great, so we'll have the first slide. That's ready. So you might be aware of life cycle assessments through the integration in BREEAM. And actually one of the biggest changes which came in with BREEAM 2018 within the MAT 01 issue is this move away from the Green Guide rating systems completely, and instead applicants are required to do a full life cycle assessment at both REBA Stage 2 and REBA Stage 4. And although the MAT 01 issue is not compulsory, BREEAM have recognised the use of LCA methodology as important within the industry at the moment, and that's been reflected in this increase of number of credits available within MAT 01, as shown on the right there. So that brings me on to the next slide. Thank you. So in terms of the actual methodology. So RIC's professional statement was released in 2017, and this actually provided a standardized approach and practical guidance for performing the whole life carbon assessments based upon the BSEN 15978 method, which Richard mentioned. And this approach actually goes further and above the BRE requirements under BREEAM. And one of the key aspects of RICS is the template of reporting, which you can see on the right. And actually, by creating a standard template format, this has enabled comparisons of different developments like for like, which, as you can imagine, is really important in the industry. And this has actually created some foundational guidance, which the whole industry has followed on from. And I'll just come on to some of those. So in 2018, REBA then published a guide to the life cycle assessment methodology, explaining how it should be applied within the context of the REBA work stages. And then in January of this year, LETI released their embodied carbon primer, which went a step further in suggesting some quite ambitious targets for the industry to follow. And then more recently, the GLA have brought out the whole life cycle carbon assessments guidance for planning stage, and Cundall helped determine this. And also around the same time, Cundall were developing an online calculation platform for the Construction Industry Council in Hong Kong. And as I mentioned earlier, Qian's going to speak on those in more detail. So in terms of other institutions and what their relationship is with whole life carbon assessments, so quite recently, both the iStructE and CIBSE have published guidance on how to apply life cycle carbon methodology within their area of the industry. And not only is this enabling greater consistency in calculations, it's also allowing for the opportunity of some robust comparisons against the benchmarks, such as those from LETI. And yeah, Cundall also helped contribute to these. And yes, with that knowledge, I can tell you that CIBSE will be releasing the TM65 in the new year as a replacement for TM56, and the same with the embodied carbon of MEP products report that will also be coming out in the new year. So with all of that information in mind, I'm now going to pass on to Qian, who's going to explain a bit further. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, and thanks for attending the seminar today. And my name is Qian Li. I'm the principal engineer for Cundall, heading up the whole life carbon assessment. And as Sarah and Richard said earlier, I'm going to explain the process we have worked with GLA for the whole life carbon assessment procedures for the Linnell plan, and also I'm going to give an overview on what we have done for the Hong Kong local government for the with Construction Industry Council about online calculation platform. And the Linnell plan asks for all the referable schemes that will need to calculate whole life carbon and submit during their part of the planning application, and also demonstrate actions for reduction. What Cundall have done is we were employed by Great Linnell Authority to write a guidance on how people or applicant should do to follow this procedure, and what information they need to provide, and the method they need to follow. The core of the methodology is the British standard and the RICS professional statement. But there's lots of interpretations of how to read, how to analyze against those requirements, and what assumptions need to be made at each stage. And the guidance have set out or give a proper explanation on this. And also what we've done is we gave template and set up benchmarks for people to compare their assessment result against, although they're not required at the moment to meet a certain number for their planning. But those are benchmarks we set up based on our assessment results, combining with some other data provided by other practitioners or other offices to provide a benchmark or guidance of where a standard practice embodied carbon or whole life carbon numbers would look like. And in terms of what, compared to other targets like LETI and RBS set up, which are more stringent, because those are set deliberately to be very challenging for people to achieve. That's trying to push the industry forward. But the purpose of the Greenland Authority at the moment is to gather data and encourage people to do the assessment, and with a view, when they collect more data, to get a more robust reduction requirement in the next version of the Greenland Authority's London plan, hopefully they will be including a reduction target based on project types. And also, what we also noticed when doing this piece of work, we realized there's some discrepancies between the targets in LETI, RBA, and in fact the aspirational target of the benchmark of the GLA. And Cundall is currently leading a work stream within LETI to align in a certain ways to make those numbers at least reporting against the same modules or same scope of reporting. So make sure there are certain alignment, although the number and target might be different, though we're trying to achieve certain alignment within those targets. As I said, we also developed a reporting template people need to fill in and submit back to Greenland Authority during the part of the planning process. This enables people to review the data submitted and also make it easier to compare data with each other. We follow the same reporting template we set out in the RCS professional statement. Again, this to provide a consistent reporting format and also to make sure people are reporting the necessary modules during the necessary lifecycle stages. You need to provide information at your pre-app and also outline and detail planning stage. And also more importantly, you need to provide a post-construction or post-completion update after the project is completed, which is kind of in a simplified diagram, is something more like this. In the pre-app stage, you are required to do or complete a series of I think about 18 or 20 yes or no early stage questions, is to set out the scene of the site for you to for the reviewer to understand the site condition, and also I think with a view to encourage people to consider sort of the easier or better that earlier can be adapted earlier, or things could be adapted early on. So if any structures on site you could retain, or anything you can utilize and reuse on site, that those early stage decisions will able to have a much greater impact if they can be considered from day one or when setting out the brief. And when you have more information, you are ready to supply or apply for outline or detailed planning application. You need to do a proper assessment, like we said, following all the proper methodologies and follow the guidance. And in those stages, you need to submit your application and complete the assessment template, which again you need to provide material quantities and assumptions you will have and whatever specification you have available at the time of application. And also you need to demonstrate actions or thoughts you have considered or you have tried to reduce whole life carbon impact of your building. And this also aligns with the BREEAM process, which asks you to do applications submissions at stage 2 and stage 4. But sorry, at stage 2, stage 4 is not this required for the London plan stages. But as Sarah explained, this is actually going slightly beyond what required at the minimum for BRE. So hopefully by carrying out the London plan level of reporting, you should cover the same requirement, should have covered the same requirement for BREEAM for stage 2. And the energy officers or reviewers will review the submitted, and they will review it against a sort of the policy to check if your application or submission actually following the proper standard, and also they will review the data quality. And again, after getting your planning application, you construct your building, and also when you finish it, you are required to provide a post-completion update within 3 months of completion of the building to verify the commitment or reductions you said you were going to do at your planning application stage. Of course, if you couldn't achieve some of them for any reasons, I don't think there are any liability per se at the moment, but the policy asks you to provide explanations or lessons learned. This way, I think this is one good step forward, also like a BSIN of whole life carbon, to make sure people are re-evaluating this again once the building is built. And also this will provide very valuable lessons learned, say what options could be adopted and what they could have done to make this option or make this method applicable for their future similar projects. As I said, the energy officers will review the data submitted. Depending on what stage you submitting your application, the data will be reviewed in terms of how complete the data is. If you include all the modules of what we ask you to report, all the building components, have you reported against all the life cycle modules, so module A, B, C, and D, have they all been incorporated? And are the data submitted of sufficient quality and quantity? For example, this was one of the examples we reviewed together with the manager officers. In this submission, the waterproofing membrane is actually having a much bigger impact than ready-mix concrete and reinforcement bars. It's highly unlikely, the most likely this will indicate an error in the data input. It might be a signal was gone wrong, or they're referring to a different material by mistake. Things like this will be picked up during the review process and will be sent back and ask people to verify or at least check if that actually makes sense. And in some cases they will be asked to provide evidence to confirm that. And also the level reduction you have achieved and the level ambitions you want to achieve. I mean that depending on the complexity of the site, it might be difficult to achieve very great reduction for some buildings, but some sites might be easy to achieve great reductions or depend on topology of the building. And they rather than only see the final number of your building, what they are also going to see is the trajectory of reduction or what effort have been made to demonstrate they are trying their best or have tried everything is possible to reduce whole life carbon of the building. And the consultation for the whole life carbon guidance is open till January 2021. And we have, of course, some of the questions that we receive will enable us to update this guidance as part of the consultation process. Some key questions we received were how people calculate embodied carbon for MEP components, because when we were writing this guidance, the CPC guidance was not sort of ready yet. But in the new year, they'll be publishing that, so we'll make a reference to this document, so people can refer to that to calculate or to estimate MEP component whole life carbon impact. And also, there's some questions about grid condensation. Again, that will be addressed in the consultation update. And as I said before, the key purpose of the benchmark is not for people to say this is the reduction you have to achieve. It's for people to start submitting data, and also for GLA to have verified or reviewed data, so they can start collecting with a view to create a benchmark in the next version or a few years later in the next revision of the plan. And also in the similar time, we carried out this exercise for Hong Kong local government, for Construction Industry Council. They asked us if we could develop a free-for-all online assessment or data capturing tool for the construction project in Hong Kong. And what we did is we created a sort of basically from scratch, a embodied carbon database for Hong Kong, because again, Hong Kong is heavily dependent on material import from nearby nations or nearby countries and or regions. And there's no embodied carbon database exists in Hong Kong. So what we did is we looked at material database of the nearby countries who supply material to Hong Kong, and we picked the the material from this, and we created a bespoke database for Hong Kong and applied the appropriate transportation and applied if the adjust agreed to reflect it. We updated the database to reflect as much as we could the local condition of Hong Kong when the material arrives to Hong Kong. And this actually have been quite a successful launch. We got, I mean, for Hong Kong, we got over 500 materials in the database, and also over 150 projects being registered or data being implemented. And the way this is set out to do is there are two methods of input. The engineers or architects, they have the login for their project at design stage. They could input design information. They can make choices of materials, and they can compare their design options and during design stage by swapping materials. And also what also quite useful is during construction, the contractors or the builders will have a login for the project. Then they cannot edit the design information, but what they are doing is they will feed into the tool using the data from construction. They were using that's what when they almost like comparing the as built data with the design. And again, the tool enables you to compare different material specifications and their impact of the design overall. Again, you can compare design options in this case, and when the contractor is on board, they can provide input into this to demonstrate how the as-built data is. And again, there's a lessons learned tab in this to record any mistakes or anything they realize they could done further. So it's have a similar purpose like the BSIM process. But also this is at the moment only capturing A1 to A5. Haven't include the whole life, but the method is there and the platform is there. It's quite easy to be updated, and also it's scalable and repeatable for other countries and nations, and also they can be used for different parts of the world. So I think just brief summary of what we talked earlier today is the legislations are changing. Everybody sort of all declared climate emergency, and part of the key message from that is people need to look at their buildings or the product from a holistic point of view, or apply whole life cycle thinking, or apply the circular economy way of thinking. Design is changing. The industry, although slowly, but it's just supply chain designers are changing. The way they think, the way they consider buildings are different now. And there are industry-wide upfront embodied carbon target, albeit LETI and RBA, they will have slightly different numbers, but with more data become available, they will become more aligned and become more transparent in terms of assessment results. And the GLA require you to verify your application at completion, which I think is a very good step forward. That will drive the accuracy and will drive the industry to deliver a much lower embodied carbon built environment. And to capture the sort of what quick win you could apply, or the earliest things you could consider. I mean, obviously you could, the earlier you consider the whole life carbon principles or circular economy principles, the better, because then that's most efficient or the most cost-effective period to apply this without minimum disruption to the design program. For example, you can retain, if you could make a financially viable scheme, you could retain existing building structures where you could. And of course, CLT or closet-made timber flooring or glue-lime structures are becoming more popular, albeit they have some limitations. But if you could consider this or make it feasible for your project, that'd be quite beneficial in terms of reducing whole life carbon. And also for any new material to use, make sure that can either be made from recycle, reuse a source, and the way you design it, the way you build it, you need to make sure they can be reused if possible. Not only consider recyclability, also is the reusability. For example, if you have a structural steel system frames, but all your steel are actually bespoke size, that almost make it impossible straight away to be reused directly. It can be recycled, that's not common, but if it's all from different sizes, you have to melt it down, and you have to transport it to somewhere else to and make it into a same steel again. But that's not the sort of full circular economy way we're promoting here. And also, if you could somehow say have a hallmark system, you can put a seal or something on your structural steel beam, the sizes, the load, the year manufacturing. That will make it easier for people to reuse it. And same with a lot of other products. And sometimes it's quite simple to modify or to change a little bit of your spec or manufacturing process that will deliver a much greater benefit in terms of whole life cycle thinking. Okay, I think that's the end of my sort of whole life carbon service presentations. For Kundal, I think we can help the industry and most of our clients in terms of net zero carbon, and also we do lots of corporate level strategy reporting in terms of life cycle carbon, whole life carbon, and also if you're looking for carbon neutral certification and even just reporting the corporate level carbon footprint and or project level, we're happy to help. So I might just hand over to Nella for questions and answers. You're on mute, Nella.
Apologies, everyone. Thank you, Qian. We'll just start off with a few questions. If anybody has any they'd like to ask, please use the Q&A box and we'll endeavour to answer them all live today. First question, the climate science shows that we need to more than halve our emissions in the next 10 years. So shouldn't we be focusing on upfront embodied carbon reductions rather than whole life emissions? Richard, do you want to start with that one? And Qian, I think you probably have something to say on that as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that one. It's quite right. We do need to be pushing down emissions as soon as we possibly can. But I wouldn't recommend focusing simply on upfront carbon, because there's risks of building in unintended consequences later in the life cycle. Yes, upfront embodied carbon is incredibly important to reduce, but whole life carbon, you also need to think about things like replacement rates and so forth, because there's no point in installing a low carbon facade, for example, if you need to replace it every 5 years, if you've got higher replacement rates than you would do otherwise. So it's about trying to take that more strategic view, about trying to work out how the building is going to operate and how it is going to be managed, so that you're minimizing the impacts throughout its life cycle. Upfront, very important, but we also need to make sure we're looking at what the rest of the life cycle looks like as well during the design process.
Qian, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think Richard is a very good point, because sometimes if you only too focus on upfront, although it's quite important to make sure you lower the upfront carbon as much as you could, it's not to do any unintended consequences, because if you say use a low carbon material but need much more replacement than a sort of slightly higher upfront carbon material but need much less replacement, and then that's why I think the life cycle way of thinking is quite important. I think that's it.
Okay. Thank you. Next question. Are there any plans for taxation of carbon, as it feels like the most efficient way for the required changes to be achieved? Richard?
So this is a very trendy question at the moment, shall I say. Over the past few months, there have been rather public battles between Treasury and Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy about the best approach to taxing emissions. There are basically two schools of thought, one of which is you tax producers directly. The other is a cap and trade. So similar to what we have at the moment in terms of the EU emissions trading scheme. It's a cap and trade system. There is a cap that's placed on, and then you can trade your credits if you want, which places a price on carbon. We're currently, I think, moving towards the latter, probably more of an emissions trading scheme route. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of hybrid that comes out of the back of it. In terms of what kind of impact it would have, it's worth stating, though, that even a global carbon tax, and it's worth noting, with all of these things, there are issues with goods passing between countries because you don't want to be offshoring your emissions. You don't want to be taxing producers in the UK and then putting them out of business as a result. But even a global tax on carbon wouldn't necessarily drive us below 2 degrees alone. So it's one of the tools in the box, and it potentially could be quite powerful, but there's still a heck of a lot more that we will need to be doing in order to achieve our carbon budgets.
Great, thank you. Next question, can you please give us some indication as to what areas are proposed to be aligned between GLA and LETI whole life carbon assessments?
Sure, I think the not challenge is the complexity of the target or benchmark we have been received. People think, or the questions we all have is the LETI target is very ambitious, but also we need to make it more transparent and say what is included in assessment, although the scope of reporting and what are actually required to do. And also because what is not clear is people don't know what should be part of LETI target, what was not. And if LETI is the target are based on actual projects or space ambitions, that's what we're trying to resolve at the moment with the work I'm heading at the moment. Basically, what we're trying to do is we provide a published database of what we think is a good target and the data we're going to use behind it. And we're going to propose the same for GLA and any other method. Basically, we're trying to have the same basis, at least for the benchmarks or the targets. We need to be able to define a target that is sort of deliverable and is more transparent for people can trust, because we've seen lots of reports claiming they meet various targets. But if you drill down in the report, those data are not sort of accurate enough or not the full scope of reporting. I think that's one of the challenges we're facing, because people look at one number, they think they achieved it, but if you're not doing it properly, you're not assessing it using the correct methodology, there's a danger of you missing out on a few areas. So that we're trying to do to at least align the scope of reporting, and also we're trying to align the template or the format reporting to make sure people can actually rely on those results or rely on those target settings. Because again, if client adopt those targets, as in industry, we need to be able to deliver this, or at least client know what they're asking for will have certain impact of the building. I think that's what we're trying to align with GLA and RBA and LETI.
Okay, and following on from that question, I think, Qian, this next one's probably follows on from it. Is there a risk that the whole life carbon benchmarks in the guidance quickly become out of date given the delay in the publication of the London plan?
I think I don't think that the benchmark will be out of date because they are based on projects in the last 5-10 years. You're never going to be able to do a live benchmark because they reflect the current market still play, and also the material you build the building with is probably going to be manufactured a couple of years or a few months earlier. Now, it's not something I'm not expecting things to change significantly, but again, that what the work we're doing with Latin now, if the updated number, if the benchmarks we are gathering is significantly different from what we have gathered before, which I don't think that will be the case. And we have the opportunity to go back to the policy as part of the consultation to update that, or at least to make some comment against that benchmark to say this is the newer data showing a trajectory of reduction of X, Y, or Z. But from my what I'm saying so far, I don't think that's likely to happen in terms of great changes in the benchmark all of a sudden because it's doing 1 year later, the numbers are low, significantly lower. I don't think that that's happening as yet.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What is the one policy move that the UK needs to make with regard to existing buildings and net zero to meet the 2050 goal?
I guess I'll pick that one up. I mean, it's a cliche, but there isn't a silver bullet, unfortunately. We need to be retrofitting virtually all of our existing 30 million or so buildings in the UK in just 30 years. Which is a level of challenge which no single policy can ever achieve. I think with regard to just housing, we need to retrofit more than 1.8 homes every minute between now and 2050. And that's if we go back and do each of them only once, which we're not doing any of that at the moment. We're still just doing 1 or 2 measures. In order to actually transform the existing building stock, we need a clear plan. We need targets for where we need to get to by when, and we need a whole set of regulations for different types of tenures, different types of buildings, supported by finance mechanisms which help to bring investment in, and supported by incentives as well. And far too often we're seeing a default towards just one of those options. So, for example, creating regulations through minimum standards for rented properties, but at the same time taking away the tax incentives that have been in place for landlords to make improvements, is not a particularly coherent way of doing it. You need a lot of policies to pull off the scale of the transition that we are going to need over the next few years.
Thank you. You'll forgive me for not knowing this next acronym, but apart from HBERT, are there any other Revit plugins that can assess building carbon?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take the Herbert is the one Hawkins Brown, I think, developed. But there are quite a few similar Revit plugin developed. Even within Cundall, we have developed our own Revit plugin to calculate embodied carbon. But the trouble, or not the trouble, it is perfectly usable for the other design tool. You can integrate the design early on to get data. So if you compare options, but the slightly trouble of this is to get it compliant with the older methodologies or the BSEM methodologies, etc., to make it complicable with the either BREEAM or the GLA, because they need to following or be verified against certain methodology of assessment. Yeah, there are. So the answer is yes, there are quite a few that can do this, but to make it regulation compliant, that's gonna be slightly longer process for them to be verified, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all we have time for today. If you have any more questions, please feel free to get in contact with us, and we'll be sure to come back to you with an answer. In the meantime, please visit our Cundall Global YouTube channel to view other recent webinars that may be of interest. Thank you again for your attendance. Have a great Christmas, and we look forward to seeing you in 2021.